The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia Memory Plus. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia Memory Plus has 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that have been proven to help boost memory.
CocoVia Memory Plus is backed by 4 clinical trials that demonstrate improvement in 3 different aspects of memory: long-term memory, spatial memory, and word recall. The studies show improved brain function in just 8 weeks.
You can try the benefits of CocoVia Memory Plus with a 25% discount off your first month. Use the code PEOPLES25. To get the full benefits, take it daily for 8 weeks. CocoVia is offering People's Pharmacy podcast listeners a 10% discount on subscriptions. That code is PEOPLES10. Learn more at cocovia.com. A century ago, a flu epidemic caught the world by surprise. We're again struggling with a pandemic. Should we have been ready? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
How can evolutionary biology illuminate the spread of the coronavirus? Are pathogens responsible for some of our most debilitating chronic conditions like heart disease, multiple sclerosis, or even Alzheimer's disease?
Many people think of COVID-19 as a temporary infection, but there are increasing cases of long-haul syndrome. Some people who have mild infections report long-lasting, debilitating symptoms.
An evolutionary biologist tells us why.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, how the ancient encounter between microbes and humans creates enemies and allies.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, Sweden has been held up as a model for how to deal with COVID-19 without shutting down. Cafes, restaurants, bars, and businesses remained open, and younger children continued to go to school. While that seemed to work last summer, the picture is much less rosy now. The Prime Minister has just announced restrictions for several regions of the country because cases are rising rapidly. With hospitals nearing capacity, especially in their intensive care units, Swedes are being asked to work from home, interact with no one but the family members under the same roof, and avoid indoor spaces with other people. Parties, weddings, and funerals are off limits. The Prime Minister made it clear that everyone subject to these recommendations, about 70% of the population, is expected to follow them all day, every day.
A new study published in Nature shows that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, was circulating in New York City weeks before the first case was identified. The investigators had more than 10,000 blood samples taken from Mount Sinai Hospital patients between early February and July. Some were from urgent care, where many of the patients were infected with the coronavirus. Other samples represented the general population because they came from OBGYN visits, labor and delivery, cancer treatment, and routine cardiology office visits. They used a very sensitive test to detect antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. That's how they estimated that more than 1.7 million New Yorkers have been infected with the coronavirus. That represents 22% of the city's population. The infection fatality rate was about 1%, which is 10 times higher than that of influenza.
For decades, one of the most important strategies to prevent hospital-acquired infections has been hand washing. But a new study has revealed that hospital floors may also be a vector for the transmission of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The investigators traced bacterial contamination of carefully cleaned and sanitized hospital rooms. The patients were tested for bacteria such as methicillin-resistant staphylococcus or other hard-to-treat germs before they were admitted. All patients were negative for such healthcare-associated organisms. The rooms, equipment, and patients were then tested up to 3 times daily during the hospital stay. MRSA started showing up within the first day. By the 4th day, more than half of the rooms cultured positive for germs such as vancomycin-resistant enterococci, C. diff, and MRSA. Contamination started on the floors but was soon detected on patients' socks, bedding, tray tables, and other high-touch surfaces. Hospitals will need to address this previously overlooked route of contamination.
In the age of COVID, handshakes are being discouraged. Some people have adopted fist bumps or a modification called cruise taps in which only one knuckle is contacted. How well do these strategies work to reduce viral spread? According to recent research, not that well. Investigators contaminated a keyboard with a benign virus called bacteriophage MS2. Volunteers who used the keyboard were then instructed to shake hands with a test subject. They also used a fist bump greeting and a cruise tap. Hands were then cultured for MS2. The authors concluded the fist bump and cruise tap greetings could potentially reduce transmission of viruses in comparison to the handshake, but transfer occurred frequently, even with these greeting methods. To eliminate hand-to-hand transmission of respiratory and enteric viruses, alternative greeting methods that do not involve physical contact are needed.
How important is diet in the prevention of heart disease? A new study reports that inflammatory foods high in refined carbohydrates, sugary drinks, and processed meats boost the risk of strokes and heart disease. Anti-inflammatory foods such as whole grains, colorful vegetables, fruits, and beverages such as coffee, tea, and wine can be beneficial. The authors conclude that chronic inflammation caused by diet could be an important contributor to cardiovascular disease. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The coronavirus pandemic has had an impact on the entire world. Should we have been better prepared for such a catastrophe?
Humans and microbes have been evolving together for millennia. Can a better understanding of evolution help us comprehend this pandemic?
To find out, we turn to Dr. Paul Ewald. He's an evolutionary biologist specializing in the ecology of parasitism, evolutionary medicine, and pollination biology. He's professor of biology at the University of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Paul Ewald.
Nice to be back with you.
Dr. Ewald, you've been studying the interface between humans and microbes for decades. Can you give us a really quick overview of your field, evolutionary biology, and why it is uniquely positioned to study the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think the main insight from evolutionary biology is that the interests of these microbes that cause these disease is fundamentally different from our interests. Their interests are to exploit us as resources and to be transmitted from person to person. And evolutionary biology tells us how that pressure, evolutionary pressure on those microbes will lead them to be damaging or mild or somewhere in between.
Now, Dr. Ewald, I think one of the things that is very confusing as we think about SARS-CoV-2 in particular, and a number of other viruses as well, how can viruses that evolved within one species and are very well attuned to that one species then switch species, like SARS-CoV-2 may have switched to pangolins from bats, and then it went to humans. How do pathogens do that? I'm assuming there's something about the evolution.
Well, pathogens are entering our bodies all the time. And for the pathogen that is evolved for a different host, getting into our body is like a big lottery. Usually doesn't work very well for the pathogen because our immune systems have evolved to be very good at defending a variety of different organisms that are going to bump into us almost daily. And so usually this doesn't end up being a problem, but every now and then a disease organism has the right characteristics for it so that it actually can avoid being destroyed by our immune system. And then the outcome could be anywhere along a spectrum from being extremely mild and eventually being controlled pretty well by the immune system, or having additional characteristics that make it so that our immune system can't deal with it. And so basically the idea is that we're exposed to them all the time, and like a lottery, sometimes these organisms are able to make it in the face of this very sophisticated immune system we have.
Well, I've been fascinated to learn that bats have lots of coronaviruses and that somehow they're not sick, that their immune systems have somehow adapted to coronaviruses and they can function just fine. We, on the other hand, have apparently not seen this particular coronavirus before, and as a result, millions of people have been infected and hundreds of thousands have been killed. Why is it that some immune systems work really well, like bats, for this virus, and humans just don't do so well?
Well, sometimes it's a difference in the immune system, but often it's a difference in the virus. As the virus adapts to a new host, it will, if it's severe to begin with, often it will be evolving to be more mild. And so that's been the story for the coronaviruses that have been infecting people over the last millennia.
Should we have been better prepared for a pandemic? I think a lot of times we hear, oh, yeah, that's like the 1918 flu. But as an evolutionary biologist, were you anticipating that there would be something like this? And should we plan for it to happen again?
Yes, we should plan for it. Part of the problem has been that people who were talking about this danger weren't really thinking about the full sort of conceptual framework that would allow us to distinguish which of these pathogens that might be able to replicate and be transmitted in humans would be big problems and which ones would actually not be big problems. And so what happened is when you had a new pathogen in a human and it was causing severe disease, then people thought, oh, this could be a big threat, when in fact some of them were threats and others not. Usually when pathogens get into humans, they're not a big threat for causing a terrible pandemic, but because there are this certain set of characteristics of these disease organisms and human populations that would allow a disease organism to be transmitted sometimes with great efficiency from person to person. We know that sometimes these potential threats are going to materialize. And so when I'm talking about the framework for understanding which of these pathogens are likely to be threats that materialize and which ones are just going to be, potential threats, we need to be thinking about two things. One, is the disease organism severe? And secondly, can a severe disease organism be readily transmissible from person to person? And for a lot of these disease organisms that people were worried about, they really didn't have the ability to be transmitted from person to person. And if an organism gets in a human population and it really doesn't have that transmissibility, it's very difficult for that organism to evolve that transmissibility. So what we're left with is assessing right off the bat, is a disease organism something that not only is severe, but it also is highly transmissible. And for this virus, it was clear early on that it was highly transmissible. So this virus should have made all the warning lights go on in January, and all the preparedness that we had set in place in the previous administration, in the Obama administration, could have been acted on. But unfortunately, the current administration actually dismantled a lot of that preparedness and continued to fail to react to the threat that was a very real threat this time. And as a consequence, we've had in the United States a terrible experience, whereas other countries have had a really not that bad of experience at all. They've controlled this really quite quickly, and they serve as a model for how preparedness could actually be done well. And unfortunately, I'm afraid our country shows how a lack of action on the preparedness that had been generated previously led to a disaster.
Now, Dr. Ewald, given that our experience with this particular coronavirus shows us that it is capable of causing severe disease, and it is actually very transmissible. What should we expect in terms of the trajectory of virus-human interactions over the next, say, short term, maybe the next year or two, and then over the middle term of, 10 or 15 years?
Well, over the long term, we expect it to evolve to be very mild, like the other coronaviruses, because this coronavirus is dependent on people being fairly healthy to get around and transmit it. But it can still be transmitted even if individuals who are transmitting during a mild phase eventually suffer very badly. So that's the long term. Over the middle term that you're talking about, I think this process will occur over the next 15 years. In fact, I think it's occurring as we speak, but it's very difficult to get information on this. We really have to be measuring the total number of infections in a population and then quantifying measures of harmfulness and see whether those measures go down. And we really don't have good evidence for that yet. But we do have evidence that actually the deaths per reported infections are going down. The problem with that statistic is that a lot of things can influence it. The age distribution can change. People can become better at treating the virus. But still, we have overall a tendency that is very strong for the deaths per reported infection to be declining. And we expect that to be the case because these organisms, these viruses, are not very strongly able to be transmitted from sick people. The coronaviruses are a little bit in between sort of the spectrum from mild viruses to harmful viruses that have been adapted to humans, because for these respiratory tract viruses, the key variable is how durable is it in the external environment. The more durable the parasite is in the external environment, the less it relies on humans to be mobile, moving around, because it can contaminate the environment, and then other people can be infected from the contaminated environment. So in the case of this coronavirus and other coronaviruses, they can last for an intermediate duration in the external environment, much like the influenza virus can. And so we expect that they should eventually evolve down to a death rate of about one death per 10,000, one death per 1,000 infections, somewhere in that range, which is where the influenza viruses evolved to. So that's actually very good news, because at the beginning of this epidemic, beginning of the pandemic, we had a death rate of about one death out of every 200 infections, one death out of every 100 cases to one death out of every 50 cases, sort of depending on the population. So what we're expecting from the theory is that the death rate will evolve to be over an order of magnitude lower once the virus adapts to humans than it is right now. And so the answer to your question is viruses generating a lot of variability all the time, and this evolution towards reduced virulence should be happening, like I say, as we speak. And so the question is, does that show up when we actually quantify the measures of mortality appropriately? We could, by using quantifications like the deaths per infection, but also the proportion of infections that are symptomatic. That's another way we could quantify how harmful the virus is.
You're listening to Dr. Paul Ewald, an evolutionary biologist specializing in the evolutionary ecology of parasitism, evolutionary medicine, and pollination biology. He's professor of biology at the University of Louisville, in Louisville, Kentucky.
After the break, we'll find out how evolutionary biology can help explain why COVID-19 symptoms may last for months in some people.
Many of our modern illnesses, like heart disease, may be caused by unsuspected pathogens.
Which conditions might be related to infectious organisms?
Researchers may have a hard time convincing their colleagues of evidence linking schizophrenia, for example, to pathogens.
We'll discuss how that might apply to Alzheimer's disease.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you by Verizana Health Club. This comprehensive home testing service enables you to track crucial health markers of gut health, inflammation, metabolism, hormones, thyroid function, and many other organ systems. Regular testing can help detect health imbalances before they lead to illness. Online at Verizana.com. That's Verizana.com/health-club. Get 50% off the first month with the discount code PEOPLE50. That's PEOPLE 50. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Today, we are considering the COVID-19 pandemic from the perspective of evolutionary biology. In the past, when coronaviruses moved from animals like bats into people, many of these pathogens eventually evolved into fairly mild infections, like colds. Is that a possibility with SARS-CoV-2?
How might this virus affect human health over the long term if our immune systems aren't able to overcome it completely? Could some people suffer chronic complications from this infection? We know that the polio virus can sometimes lead to long-lasting neurological challenges. In addition, some people experience months or years of poor health following a bout of Lyme disease.
We don't usually think of heart disease as being caused by infections, but it is associated with microbes that cause gum disease. Does Alzheimer's disease have a link to infection? What sorts of problems might the current coronavirus cause over time?
We're talking with Dr. Paul Ewald, an evolutionary biologist who's been studying the connection between many common chronic diseases and low-level infection. His research interests include the evolutionary ecology of parasitism, evolutionary medicine, agonistic behavior, and pollination biology. He's professor of biology at the University of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky, and author of Plague Time, the New Germ Theory of Disease.
Dr. Ewald, we've heard about people who are referred to as long haulers. This is sort of a mysterious phenomenon, and we don't quite understand it yet. How many people have symptoms for not just a few days or a few weeks, but for months? And some of them are really quite sick. How does an evolutionary biologist understand the long hauler phenomenon when it comes to the coronavirus?
Well, I think the starting point is that this virus isn't well adapted to humans at this point. And one of the characteristics of the virus is it uses a receptor on cells that is present in many different parts of the body. And so because the virus isn't well adapted to us and we're not well adapted to controlling the virus, that leaves sort of holes in the system so that the virus can actually persist in tissues where really it shouldn't be. In other words, if the virus were well adapted, like other coronaviruses, to humans, we'd expect that these viruses would be restricted to the upper respiratory tract and they'd be not causing much damage. They'd be coughed or sneezed out, and people would remain relatively healthy, and you wouldn't have these negative effects in these other tissues that characterize the long hauler infections. So I think the answer to the question is basically that you're dealing with a virus that's not well adapted to humans yet, and so you've got some infections that are not controlled by the immune system very well because of sort of the chance characteristics of the virus. In particular, I think it's this tendency for the virus to use receptors that are found on many different tissues in the body, such as intestinal tissues, for example. There are other coronaviruses that use this same receptor, but because they've been in humans for a long period of time and have evolved to humans, they are restricting their infections to tissues that are related to transmission rather than, being spread throughout the body. And so the literature on those viruses doesn't indicate that there are long haulers, although a lot of that information in the literature is old. And so it could be that there were some long haulers that weren't recognized, that sort of ended up just not being on the radar of the researchers.
Those other coronaviruses would be the ones that cause what we call colds, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Typically, they cause illnesses that we put in that big umbrella category of a common cold.
Do we have any idea what the prospects are for a long-haul situation? Do humans eventually develop ways of being able to deal with these invaders, or is that outside the purview of an evolutionary biologist?
Well, the rate of human evolution is very slow compared to the rate of viral evolution. And so I think what we'd be looking for is the virus evolving to be more efficient at replicating in humans in a way that allows it to be sort of maximally transmitted from human to human. And so if the virus then restricts its infection to those tissues that are directly related to transmission and are not related to long-term damage, which are tissues that are not involved in transmission, then we'd expect that the virus would change. So I think that the good news is that viral evolution can happen very quickly. And as I said, it's probably happening at the moment. And this may be a reason why the deaths per reported infections have gone down really quite dramatically. In the United States, they've gone down by about 2/3. So again, we just have to be recognizing that we don't know all the causes of that. There could be a lot of different causes, but if the causes, part of the causes are the reduction in the virulence of these viruses, then we should be encouraged, because that is consistent with the idea of these viruses evolving quickly, and that we may see progressive reductions in damage that result from the viral evolution over the next months to maybe a year.
Dr. Ewald, I'd like to change gears a bit and really focus on your area of expertise, evolutionary biology. When you talked to us years ago about pathogens being responsible for many of our modern illnesses, heart disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, Lyme disease, Alzheimer's disease, fungal infections, schizophrenia, multiple sclerosis, I think you took a lot of our listeners by surprise, because we think of heart disease as a cholesterol problem, not an infectious problem. We think of schizophrenia as neurochemicals in the brain. How could that have anything to do with, a pathogen? Ditto for multiple sclerosis. So can you run through some of the health conditions that may be in some way related to infectious organisms?
Well, let me just start with a little background there, which is that when we're looking at these chronic conditions, we really don't understand the causes of them very well for most chronic conditions. And so what's emerging is that the understanding of the causes of these diseases involves interactions between various risk factors. And so the information that indicates that infections are involved in illnesses such as schizophrenia or cardiovascular disease or Alzheimer's, this information is making sense in the context of interactions between infectious processes and these other risk factors. So if you want a rundown of the diseases, it's almost all the big diseases of uncertain cause that are associated with disease organisms. But if you want the sort of more complex picture, you have to be thinking about how these risk factors that we've identified are interacting with the infectious processes. But, the point is that the infectious processes are sort of throwing our system out of balance. And so that makes us vulnerable to other risk factors that could be playing a role.
Can you give us an example? I'm sorry.
I can use really almost any example you want to raise. But if you're looking at cardiovascular disease, for example, elevated fats and cholesterol are associated with the increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and the evidence now is really strong that they're causally associated, as most people expect. But then the question is, why is it that some individuals end up suffering more from cardiovascular disease, even though they may have the same exposure to fats and cholesterol, and maybe even the same levels of cholesterol in the blood? And part of the answer is going to be genetic predisposition, and looks like another part of the answer is infectious causation. So particularly for atherosclerosis, which is a big part of cardiovascular disease, the main genetic risk factor is the presence of an allele called the epsilon 4 allele. But the epsilon 4 allele isn't a characteristic that determines whether or not you're going to get cardiovascular disease. And as it turns out, one of the main infectious candidates for causing cardiovascular disease uses this epsilon 4 protein as a way of getting into cells. And so if you look at the epsilon 4 protein, it'd be sort of mysterious as to why a protein like that would be associated with cardiovascular disease, until you realize that the genetic risk factor involves a vulnerability to an infectious agent that looks like it's contributing substantially to cardiovascular disease, and that the epsilon 4 protein is involved in transporting of fat and cholesterol. So all three of those risk factors come together to explain better why it is that we have atherosclerosis pathology developing, often starting to develop at young ages, teenage years or 20s, and then actually developing to be bad enough to cause serious problems decades later.
We've heard, for example, that gum disease is associated with cardiovascular disease. In theory, because there are bacteria in the gums when there's inflammation and infection, and that somehow is associated with the heart. Can you explain that in a little more detail?
Yes, there's been strong correlations recognized for many years between periodontal disease and gingivitis and cardiovascular disease. The problem has always been, well, how do you interpret that correlation? And what we know now, and this is really one of the better developed areas of study for understanding the interaction between infection and cardiovascular disease, what we understand now is that there are organisms that are directly causing the periodontal disease that get into the bloodstream. They cause inflammation, which looks like it fosters the pathology of the periodontal disease, and they get in the bloodstream, and it looks like they're contributing to type 2 diabetes, and they're finding their way into the walls of the arteries, probably by infecting white blood cells that then make their way into the walls of the arteries and then cause damage there. So these organisms, although we think of them as organisms of the mouth, are really quite invasive, and they're contributing to diseases that are noticed in other parts of the body by pathology in tissues far away from the tissues of the oral cavity. And so this kind of interaction also helps us understand the interplay between type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, because it looks like there's a common pathogen that is contributing to both.
Well, one of the problems of modern medicine, Dr. Ewald, is that our specialists live in silos.
Exactly.
At least that's the way it's been described. Mm-hmm. And so the cardiologist has not been that well trained in mouth bacteria and right. gingivitis and periodontal disease. And they don't think of heart problems as an infectious disease etiology. They think in terms of heart disease as cholesterol, and if they prescribe a statin, that solves the problem. But it sounds like it's much more complex than that, and I suspect there are a number of other conditions that are equally multidimensional.
Yes, exactly. Although I would say that the statins don't solve the problem, they're treating a manifestation of the problem that allows people to live longer than they would if they didn't have the statin treatment. But what your general point, I think, is exactly right. And that is a result of the way we've subdivided the body into disciplines. We've said the mouth conditions are conditions for dentists, and the rest of the body are the conditions for the physicians. And so what's happened over the last 30 years is that the dental researchers have recognized that the gingivitis and periodontitis is associated with these pathogens, and then they made the connections with cardiovascular disease. So they led the way on this. And what's more important is actually an extension of what you're saying, is that when people are an expert and they don't have the right answer, they tend to be dismissive of the right answer if somebody suggests it. So when people were finding these associations between these periodontal bacteria and atherosclerosis, the experts, the experts in sort of medicine proper, as opposed to dental medicine, were very dismissive, but the dental researchers kept going on it, and that has become developed to such an extent that now it's pretty much accepted that periodontal pathogens such as Porphyromonas gingivalis are playing a role in cardiovascular disease. But I think partly it was a result of the dental researchers not being dissuaded by the people in other areas of medicine from looking at this possibility, and they got funding through the dental research funding agencies and were able to develop this without being squashed.
I trust that there are other examples where researchers have had to be very persistent to convince those outside their own specialty that there's something going on here that requires attention.
Yes, I think there are a lot of examples, but one other example would be cancer. Now we accept that cervical cancer is caused by particularly damaging strains of the human papillomavirus. But this idea had been around for a long time, this idea that infections, particularly sexually transmitted infections, were causing cervical cancer. And in fact, it goes back 150 years, even before we really understood much about germs. A researcher was looking at the associations between cervical cancer and sexual partnerships, and concluded that cervical cancer was probably caused by something transmitted among sexual partners.
Can you think of another
Yes.
infectious disease?
Another example would be Alzheimer's disease. People thought that Alzheimer's disease was explained fully by the presence of pathological plaques and tangles in the brain. But over the last 15 years, as people have been doing experiments to reduce the development of those plaques and tangles, they weren't finding that these experimental interventions were reducing Alzheimer's. So now we're going back to the drawing board, and one of the alternative explanations that is consistent with the evidence is that when people get infections, these compounds end up being released as anti-infectious agents. So amyloid plaque is actually antimicrobial. And so the alternative view now is that the plaques and the tangles may be more consequences of damage rather than the causes of damage. And so, all this is beginning to make sense. Once we start thinking about the interactions between these causes, once we start linking together those silos into a more coherent view of the causation of disease.
You're listening to Dr. Paul Ewald, an evolutionary biologist studying how evolution shapes the effects of pathogens on human health. He specializes in evolutionary medicine, the evolutionary ecology of parasitism, and pollination biology. He's professor of biology at the University of Louisville. His books include Evolution of Infectious Disease.
Maybe it's time to start tearing down those silos in medicine. Perhaps the cardiologist should be talking with the periodontist.
And maybe infectious disease experts should be paying more attention to evolutionary biology.
After the break, we'll discuss some troublesome conditions like chronic Lyme disease or chronic fatigue syndrome.
Could pathogens be contributing to these problems?
How can evolutionary biology help us understand such disorders better?
We still don't understand the causes well at all.
Can the current coronavirus pandemic help us better prepare for future pandemics?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that help support memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Our topic on the People's Pharmacy today is how the evolution of microbes affects human health. How do pathogens interact with our microbiota, and what are the consequences for conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome?
Our guest is Dr. Paul Ewald, an evolutionary biologist specializing in the evolutionary ecology of parasitism, evolutionary medicine, agonistic behavior, and pollination biology. He's professor of biology at the University of Louisville.
Dr. Ewald, we were talking a little bit about how infectious agents might contribute to chronic conditions. And I'm wondering in particular about something like chronic fatigue syndrome or Lyme disease, and how mainstream medicine initially has been rather, I'd say, dismissive of even the idea that there's something called chronic fatigue syndrome. In the early days, it was like, no, it's all in their heads.
Or chronic Lyme disease.
And there's so much controversy around things like chronic Lyme disease. Can you help us better understand how the medical profession deals with these conditions? And again, how the pathogens may in some way contribute to conditions that last not just for weeks or months, but for years?
Well, I think there is a lot of human nature involved in this problem. And one aspect of human nature is that physicians are trained to be extremely good at certain things. And in particular, they're very good at diagnosing a problem that has an accepted answer and then suggesting treatments. The problem arises when you have a condition that doesn't have an accepted answer. And so we're venturing into the unknown. So, for example, with chronic fatigue syndrome, it was not clear what was going on. And so often when somebody feels like they're fatigued, they go to their physician, and the physician says, well, it could be all in your head, something like that. That's a failure that response is a failure to understand all the things we don't understand about causes of disease. And as I said early on, we don't understand the causes of most chronic diseases. So if we think about chronic fatigue syndrome, we can link that up with our earlier discussion about long haulers in COVID cases. And the one of the manifestations of the long haulers is chronic fatigue. Now, I think people will make up a different name for that rather than calling it chronic fatigue syndrome, but essentially it's indistinguishable from chronic fatigue syndrome. Now that we understand that this coronavirus can cause this chronic fatigue, then we'll give it a different name probably. We might call it eventually, coronavirus-induced chronic fatigue rather than calling it chronic fatigue syndrome. So as soon as you've actually got a cause, then people can handle the diagnosis much better. But without a cause, it's often, unfortunately, the case that people who are really great at diagnosing a lot of diseases will get stalled by this problem that they can't diagnose, and then they'll dismiss it. And so I think that has been the case with chronic fatigue syndrome. I think eventually we'll find out that most of the chronic fatigue syndrome is associated in one way or another with persistent infections. And it's also the case with Lyme disease, I think, because there are certain standards that people accept, and if the data don't meet those standards, they then reject a hypothesis without recognizing that the standards may not be sufficiently broad. And so in the case of Lyme disease, a lot of experts have dismissed the idea that chronic Lyme disease could be caused by a persistent infection because their particular tests, which were really geared more for the acute phase of infection, don't turn up those organisms. And so they say, well, our tests show that the person isn't infected with this particular bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi. And so we reject the idea that that organism is causing these long-term problems that the Lyme disease patients report. Now, the physicians who are actually dealing with this, as opposed to the researchers that are experts on, diagnosing Borrelia infections, those physicians often say, we've got a real problem here. This is not just the imagination of the people. And they're more likely to embrace the idea that the Borrelia is persistent, and especially when they're treating with antibiotics and they see the patients getting better, they're thinking that this is evidence supporting the idea that there's a persistent infection, and it is evidence. The other side is saying, oh, well, there's all sorts of things that can happen if you don't have a controlled experiment that could make people think they're getting better, and the antibiotics could be just anti-inflammatory and not really having an effect on the organism itself. So this controversy has been going on for over 2 decades, and it's still going on because people have sort of dug in their heels in their different positions. My view is I think that we'll find out that the organism is persistent and it's contributing to a lot of what we're seeing as chronic Lyme disease.
Well, Dr. Ewald, my question is, how can evolutionary biology help both the doctors and the researchers and even the patients understand and address a problem like this more fruitfully?
Yes. So an evolutionary perspective allows us to understand that some disease organisms are actually evolving to be persistent. And unless we recognize that, we're likely to be dismissing diseases that are associated with chronic conditions that might be correlated with the earlier presence of those pathogens but are actually caused by persistent pathogens, even though those persistent pathogens aren't noticed later on, or you can't get data to really concretely link those two. So, we can go back a long time in history for a lesson, and that lesson deals with this autoimmune disease called Sydenham's chorea. And from the late 1800s through about 1940, people were arguing back and forth about whether Streptococcus pyogenes, group A strep, is actually a cause of Sydenham's chorea, because Sydenham's chorea would occur generally a matter of a month or two, or sometimes a few weeks, but a month or two after a person got a sore throat. And once people realized that these strep organisms are causing sore throat, there's a certain group of people that said they're probably also causing Sydenham's chorea. But other people saying Sydenham's chorea, that's not caused by an infectious agent. And it was resolved after about 50 years by the development of penicillin. So once we had penicillin and we were treating people who had sore throats, they didn't get Sydenham's chorea. And
now, Dr. Ewald, I hope you will tell us all, what is Sydenham's chorea, because we have never seen it.
That's right, because people have gotten treatment for their group A strep infections, and as a result, Sydenham's chorea has pretty much vanished out of the picture. But it's a neurological disease that's associated with inadequate neuromuscular control. And what we know now is that the bacteria that are associated, these streptococcal bacteria, actually have compounds on them that are mimicking compounds on the neurons. So when we get antibodies for the bacteria, those antibodies bind to the neurons, and they cause the neurons not to function very well, and that leads to the neurological manifestations of Sydenham's chorea. And then after you get rid of the strep infection, often the immune system will get rid of those or control those strep infections over a period of a year, then the Sydenham's chorea symptoms gradually subside. And we're lucky in this one that this binding of the antibodies to the neurons didn't destroy the neurons or damage the neurons. They just temporarily made them not very functional, at least if they damaged them not that much, so that people could regain their neuromuscular function.
So it was really part of the immune system reacting.
Yes.
Aha.
Yes, and that is a lesson, because what we are doing these days is we're seeing immune-mediated pathology, and then we label it with a term autoimmune disease, and then people think they understand it. But that really is just the first step in understanding. We have to understand, why did some people's immune systems end up causing self-damage? What pushed them? We know that the immune system, even though it's incredibly complicated, can function perfectly well because most people don't have a particular autoimmune disease. So what we really have to ask is, what is it about some sort of environmental exposure that pushed some individuals to develop an autoimmune disease and others didn't? And it could also be a genetic predisposition to those environmental exposures. And so what we're finding again and again, as we look at it from this perspective of sort of connecting silos, is that the disease organisms are often involved in pushing the immune system out of balance, and then that leads to autoimmune manifestations. And this is really quite important because one of the things people do with autoimmune diseases when they are just presuming it's the immune system by itself that has just been is off kilter is they try to control that immune system by using anti-inflammatory drugs, for example. And that can be useful if the immune system is so out of whack that it's going to cause the problems really independently of the ability of the immune system to defend against pathogens. But what is potentially problematic is if the immune response is controlling the pathogens that are contributing to this overreactive, this highly reactive immune response, then we could be blocking the ability of the body or compromising the ability of the body to control those pathogens. And, when you look at the side effects and the warnings for these drugs that are quelling the immune response, it should be no surprise, given this kind of argument, that the cautionary statements are often referring to the contraindication for use of those drugs if you have infectious diseases. And
tuberculosis, for
example, exactly, or liver disease, which now is largely caused by infection. And so if you put two and two together, you realize that some of this could be a result of actually keeping the immune system from fighting the infections that are leading to the autoimmune response, or keeping the immune system from fighting other infections that are important to control but might not be actually contributing to the autoimmune response. And it's going to be both,
Well, yeah. When I watch television and I see all of the ads for these incredibly expensive drugs, these monoclonal antibody drugs to treat, for example, psoriatic or arthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, and they often say, well, yeah, tuberculosis, that could happen. Oh, and by the way, lymphoma or cancers can occur. And you're thinking, yeah, these drugs are dampening down the immune system, and they are making life much easier for people who have rheumatoid arthritis, just as patients used to get corticosteroids 50 years ago in pretty high doses. But there are consequences to dampening the immune system. Gee, wouldn't it be nice if we knew what organisms triggered the rheumatoid arthritis in the first place, or the lupus? And it seems like we're still pretty far away from figuring out the cause of things that might trigger schizophrenia, for example, or multiple sclerosis. And instead, we're treating the consequences.
That's right. And so I think if people had that perspective, if the researchers had that perspective, and if funders had that perspective, we'd be making much more rapid progress in identifying disease organisms that are actually contributing to that immune response. If you just talk about some of those diseases that you mentioned, now it's pretty much accepted that, for example, lupus and multiple sclerosis are related causally to Epstein-Barr viruses. And so the data indicate that if you don't have Epstein-Barr virus infection, you really don't get these diseases. The problem there is almost everybody has Epstein-Barr virus infections by the time they're 30 and 40. So the data are looking at the intensity of Epstein-Barr virus infection and the probability that you're going to get something like multiple sclerosis or lupus. For rheumatoid arthritis, it's still a little bit more confusing as to what's going on. But even for all of those diseases, it's very likely that you have something like Epstein-Barr virus that is opening the door for the disease. And then you've got some other causal risk factor that is actually working together with something like Epstein-Barr virus to actually bring about the disease. And so we're actually getting to the point where we really have to be thinking about multifaceted causation. We have to be thinking about genetic predispositions to viral infections, genetic predispositions to non-infectious environmental conditions, and we have to be thinking about interactions between different infectious agents, that can be bringing about a disease and interactions between non-infectious environmental conditions and the probability that an infection will be exacerbated. So it really is a time where I think we're going to be making progress if we're thinking about these complex interactive networks and causation, rather than just thinking about sort of a simplistic idea that it's a gene that causes disease or that it's an infection that causes the disease, and end of story.
Dr. Ewald, what should we be learning from this current coronavirus pandemic that will help us prepare better for future pandemics?
Well, I think the main thing we need to be learning is that we have to have pandemic preparedness in place. But together with that idea, we have to have an understanding of why we have just a small number of these emerging diseases that really are carrying a big, viable pandemic threat. And that takes us back to what I was saying at the outset. We have to look at these pathogens and say, we've got a severe pathogen. Can it be readily transmissible in the general population? Or are we just seeing the pathogen transmissible in a very specific population? So if we look at Ebola virus, we say it really doesn't have the characteristics to be highly transmissible in general populations. It's mainly transmissible when people aren't careful about really close contact. If we look at, some of these vector-borne diseases like West Nile virus that people have raised the alarm over, we realize it's just not transmissible from human back to mosquitoes. And so it doesn't have that much pandemic potential. If we look at other coronaviruses like the SARS viruses, the first SARS-CoV-1 and then the MERS virus, if you look at the transmission, they really didn't have this ability to be transmitted readily. So basically what we need to do is have this pandemic preparedness in place, but we have to have sort of guidelines about which diseases are going to be a big threat. And then the last part of that is to recognize that some of these diseases that are a threat for causing a pandemic could cause long-term problems indefinitely, and others might have problems that are really bad in the short run or medium run, and that eventually become ameliorated in the long run, but they can still do a tremendous amount of damage in the short and medium run. And I think that's where this current coronavirus lies. But we can be really quite thankful that this coronavirus isn't really durable in the external environment like the smallpox virus or like the plague organism, because if that were the case, the theory tells us that it would maintain its harmfulness over a much longer period of time, perhaps indefinitely.
Dr. Paul Ewald, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy.
It's my pleasure.
You've been listening to Dr. Paul Ewald, an evolutionary biologist who studies how evolutionary processes shape the effects of pathogens on human health. He specializes in the evolutionary ecology of parasitism, evolutionary medicine, and pollination biology. He's professor of biology at the University of Louisville. He's the author of Plague Time, the new germ theory of disease.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
And by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1234. The number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit the website, you can share your thoughts about today's show. You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. It's posted on our website every Monday morning.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.